Hi, Dave.
Testing. Hi,
Okay.
Adam. Hi. Hi, everyone.
Great. And now we're looking forward to a special session with David Pearce.
And I was really just planning to say a few words and then essentially really more of an open-ended discussion, because I know some of you at least are pretty familiar with the core of what I do, the Biohappiness Revolution. No surprises, not everyone. And I thought we could discuss essentially whatever people want. Some questions about long-termism, for instance. I have been quite, shall we say, disconcerted because the transhumanist movement and the effective altruist movement seem to overlap to a large extent, but the effective altruist community has pirouetted in its short history from essentially tackling real existing sources of human and non-human animal suffering to AI safety. This is the idea of a runaway intelligence explosion, AI that goes boom and turns us into paper clips, to most recently the growth of long-termism. This is the idea that the value or disvalue of what we do now is almost exclusively determined by its effects on the far future. And not all EAs think we should be going, shall we say, focusing on getting rid of all forms of suffering now. It's essentially very, very unstructured, this, beyond what I hope is going to be just this short little 5-minute introduction. I will then chat and extemporize, but hopefully the introduction is more promised.
Can I introduce you first, David?
Of course, yes.
Well, welcome everybody. This is David Pearce, and he has a long history in the transhumanist movement. He first wrote The Hedonistic Imperative in going back to 1995. That's actually quite a long time ago in the history of the movement, really. I don't know if there were many transhumanists around then, but the numbers have grown exponentially. So he argues that we should rewrite our post-human ancestors, or even us, should rewrite the vertebrate genome, redesign the global ecosystem, and abolish suffering throughout the living world. In 1998, David Pearce co-founded the World Transhumanist Association, now H+, with Nick Bostrom. And he's been the fellow of many sort of organizations, including the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and on the advisory boards of all sorts of organizations like the Qualia Research Institute and the Center of Long-Term Risk. Yes, welcome, David Pearce. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm in Australia. I know that some of the people tuning in are in the UK and from other parts of the world, I imagine. So thanks all for coming along and participating.
Adam, thank you. First, can I start on an extremely mundane note? This little video introduction, as I said, it's 5 minutes.
The Biohappiness Revolution. Life is suffering, said Gautama Buddha. Evolution via natural selection is a monstrous engine for creating mental and physical pain. Sentient beings deserve a more civilized signaling system. Mercifully, a biohappiness revolution is imminent. Genome editing promises to transform human nature and life itself. CRISPR-Cas9 is a game changer. The biosphere can be reprogrammed. Our reward circuitry can be upgraded. CRISPR-based gene drives turn the level of suffering and bliss in the living world into an adjustable parameter. Pain can be mitigated, minimized, and then abolished. Biotech can make experience below hedonic zero physiologically impossible. The world's last unpleasant experience will be a precisely datable event a few centuries from now. Transhuman civilization will be based on a new motivational architecture, life underpinned entirely by information-sensitive gradients of well-being. Genetic recalibration of the hedonic treadmill will replace the biology of suffering with life animated by gradients of superhuman bliss. And the biohappiness revolution will then accelerate. The lower bounds of transhuman well-being will be orders of magnitude richer than human peak experiences. Superhuman intensity of bliss will be matched by a lifelong superhuman sense of meaning, purpose, and significance. In short, paradise engineering. But when and how? What are the preconditions of post-Darwinian life? All factory farms and slaughterhouses should be closed and the surviving victims rehabilitated. Pigs, for instance, are as sentient as small children and should be treated accordingly. The development and commercialization of cruelty-free cultured meat and animal products should be accelerated. Civilization will be vegan. Second, all prospective parents worldwide should be offered pre-implantation genetic screening and CRISPR genome editing to pre-select the pain thresholds and hedonic range of their future children. Pre-implantation screening will be hugely cost-effective. Reckless genetic experiments, such as today's products of sexual reproduction, should be discouraged. Ideally, all babies should be designer babies. Third, trials should begin of somatic gene therapy for existing humans. An unfolding revolution in genetic medicine promises a one-off injection for invincible mental superhealth. This promise of perpetual well-being sounds complete hype. How can the jab of a needle confer lifelong protection against physical and mental pain? But consider today's extreme genetic outliers like retired vegan schoolteacher Joe Cameron. Joe is constitutionally happy and pain-free in virtue of her unique genetic makeup. In principle, a single intravenous CRISPR infusion could tweak everyone's far and far out genes to function like Joe's. Gene-edited humans rich in anandamide, and the Sanskrit term for bliss, will be blissful but not blissed out. Fourth, genome editing and CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives can extend the biohappiness revolution to all free-living non-human animals. Pilot studies should begin of self-contained blissful mini-biospheres free from starvation, predation, and the other cruelties of Darwinian life. More broadly, we need a 100-year plan to defeat suffering throughout the living world. Surely the world isn't ready for such a utopian vision. Yet such an organisation exists. It commands global authority. The World Health Organization is dedicated to the promotion of good health for everyone as laid out in its founding constitution of 1946. And what exactly is the WHO conception of health? Quote, "Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being," end quote. Note the complete. Complete well-being is an astonishingly bold definition of health. Compare the incomplete mental health in the guise of information-sensitive dips in extreme well-being urged by some supposedly wild-eyed transhumanists. So the world needs the counterpart of a Greta Thunberg to remind politicians to live up to their responsibilities for public health. The abolition of suffering through medical science and the creation of life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss.
And yes, thank you to Duarte who knocked up that little video so people don't just listen to my voice. Yeah, essentially that's the gist of the biohappiness revolution. But what, as I said, I really wanted to do was to have a freewheeling discussion about what people think effective altruists and transhumanists ought to be doing now. So before going any further, yes, has anyone got any particular questions they'd now like to actually see addressed?
Just the one question that you just asked was,
Yes.
how can transhumanists and effective altruists start making this happen now? Because it is fanciful and utopian and sci-fi to most people. So, and also on a practical level, because you need to include 8 billion people, and count me in on that, you know. But so, how do you make it happen now?
Yes, it's an absolutely monumental challenge, and at times my heart sinks of the challenges involved. I mean, personally, I think the most urgent thing that people can do right now, if they don't already, is to stop eating meat and animal products and urge others to do likewise. But one has to be completely realistic about this. The most realistic way to get the death factories shut and outlawed in this century is cultured meat and animal products. And I think the way forward there is legislation that mandates the closure of slaughterhouses, not instantly, which I think, of course, should be the case, but legislation that, let's say, kicks in by the year 2030. Now, this gives tremendous commercial incentives for the development, the commercialization of cultured meat and animal products. There was a poll conducted by the Sentience Institute that I didn't believe when it was first published, but apparently it's been replicated. When asked, 47% of Americans said they would be in favor, to some extent, of closing slaughterhouses. And I just couldn't believe this. Could this disconnect be so great? Now, as I said, I don't think that this is actually viable, any kind of legislation now. But what I think it is politically feasible with the growth of commercial meat and animal products to lobby for legislation for the closure of slaughterhouses. Now, as many animal activists would stress, slaughterhouses are only one part of the apparatus of oppression. But without slaughterhouses, factory farms, and all the rest of stuff, essentially, it can't. The apparatus of oppression can't function. So that is something very, very concrete. The other parts of the abolitionist project, the Biohappiness Revolution, much realistically, much longer term. Essentially, if we are to get rid of the biology of pain and suffering in humans, there's a twin track approach. One is going to be somatic gene therapy, and this is going to be feasible in our lifetime. But the only way long term to ensure the life can be based on information sensitive gradients of well-being, starting with today's hyperthymic people with extremely high hedonic set points, is realistically going to be universal access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, CRISPR genome editing. And that is highly controversial, of course. What is going to be less controversial is getting rid of the well-known genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis. Even this is an immense minefield. I mean, take something like Down syndrome, for example. People with Down syndrome are unusually happy. In one study, 99% of people with Down syndrome are self-reportedly happy. Yes, it will be possible to use pre-implantation genetic screening and counseling to avoid something like Down syndrome, but there are real ethical issues here. But to move beyond tackling existing well-known genetic diseases to depression and pain, much more controversial. Now, something like pain thresholds, for example, although there are hundreds of different genes involved in pain processing, there is the so-called volume knob for pain. And it would be perfect. This is the SCN9A gene with dozens of different alleles ranging from 0 pain sensitivity, but also 0 nociception, to other alleles associated with high or low pain thresholds. And if one could gain political consensus, it would be possible to actually choose the pain thresholds, pain sensitivity of all future children. Should responsible parents make sure that their kids have an extremely high pain threshold? What are the pitfalls? Of course, there are legion. That's the kind of illustration. Sorry, I've just got a question. I worry that these ideas are currently still so far outside of the Overton window that most people outside of the transhumanist sphere will immediately scream eugenics and dystopia in reaction. I don't think they'll necessarily be swayed. Yes, I mean, this is true. But consider the three supers of, or crudely, very crudely, the three supers of transhumanism: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. In the case of the other two supers, super longevity and super happiness, 15, 20 years ago, they were outside the Overton window. Whereas now, thanks to some very powerful, I say powerful both intellectually and powerful in terms of personality, transhumanists and others, they are seriously discussed by some very mainstream people. And this is partly to do with the kind of power dynamics of a chimpanzee troop. And though what I have been talking about, yes, it's currently outside the Overton window, imagine if an Elon Musk were to say, let's use biotechnology to phase out suffering. It really is, it's both a combination of making the ethical, intellectual arguments, showing what is technically possible, and the political campaigning and organizing. And I personally haven't got the strength of character and personality, sadly, to do some of the lobbying, the organization building, and so forth. I'm essentially, sadly, basically a writer who can talk a bit. But yeah, shifting the Overton window partly involves simply just remorselessly making the case. Something like, here's an example. Something like wild animal suffering. It's a huge problem. I never thought it would be discussed in my lifetime, but now there are quite a number of Facebook groups, academic papers discussing the problem, possible solutions. Something like, for example, reprogramming predation, phasing out predators. Most people, when they hear the idea of phasing out predation, their response is that absolutely crazy, way beyond the Overton window. Crazy philosophers don't understand the thermodynamics of a food chain. It's ecologically illiterate. But when you actually spell out what is involved, if one wants a living world where sentient beings don't eat each other, spell out the technicalities of cross-species fertility regulation via immunocontraception, tunable gene drives, and so on, then at least a minority of younger people in particular start to take the ideas seriously. But yeah, it is an absolutely daunting challenge. I wish I could do a Ray Kurzweil on you and tell you 2045, the world's last experience below hedonic zero. I can't do that at all. I think, sadly, although technically we could get rid of the biology of suffering in 100 years, in practice, a biohappiness revolution is going to take hundreds of years at best. Forgive me now, I'm going to just look at the screen of chat so I can see some of the I promise too that any questions people make that don't get a proper response, or only something rather perfunctory or ignored, I will do follow-ups too, and we can have a follow-up discussion. Let me just read this now. With the current wider conscious acceptance of vaccines, perhaps one early method of gene editing could be vaccines that act against expressions and receptors that cause psychological distress. Yes, of course, vaccines themselves are, they shouldn't be, but they are controversial. But yes, most people, in some cases reluctantly, are essentially, so vaccination against COVID. And imagine if it were possible to give yourself the functional equivalent of Joe Cameron's genes. Joe Cameron, recall, is this retired vegan Scottish school teacher, 70 to 73 years old now. She thought she was completely normal, but she never gets depressed, is never anxious, and has an extraordinarily high pain threshold. Pain felt for her like a tickle. Now, in principle, it would be possible with extensions of existing technologies to give yourself the extremely high levels of anandamide, which is what Joe Cameron has in virtue of her far and far out genes, to help existing humans. Now, of course, there are immense ramifications here, in that, to use a fairly obvious example, where there's a huge difference between a genteel school teacher in Scotland and a normal kid, rough and tumble. And if you have an exceptionally high pain threshold, you are more likely to do reckless, stupid things. So it might be actually extremely imprudent to give people both versions of Joe Cameron's. As I said, she has this almost unique, only one other case is currently known for far and far out mutation. But nonetheless, it will be possible to do trials. Anandamide, this endogenous cannabinoid that her levels are abnormally high, it's not literally the bliss molecule. Anandamide derives from the Sanskrit term for bliss, but in fact, it's the way it interacts with the opioid system. Tremendous pitfalls. Okay, let me read this. Adam Karlovsky says, once people see healthy adults voluntarily exemplifying the benefits of vaccines when they're efficacious, they'll be more interested in modifying their babies. Yes. Okay. Adam writes, you've outlined that veganism should come first, designer children second, and editing existing humans third. However, the reverse order might be more realistic, even less ideal. Yes, that is also true, because bioconservative critics draw this distinction between germline editing, which is supposedly beyond the pale. People are worried there's this kind of specter of eugenics, and the idea of individual sovereignty over your own body, that you ought to be able to choose what you do with your own body. So politically, this might be possible, but part of me is still thinking about shifting the Overton window. I don't know how it can best be done. As I said, I have been disconcerted within the effective altruist community. This very recent shift from avoiding tackling existing sources of suffering to possibly we should be engaging in a period of long reflection that rather than tackling the problem of suffering now, our biggest focus should be on existential risk. And I can say a few words on that now, but I don't know if I know Adam made some points in a chat earlier, but does anyone want to interject and say anything about long-termism?
There are two hand raisers, Les Allen and Ariel Zelenif. I can't say that name, sorry. Les?
Thanks. I've got a question, David, and let me preface it with I'm all for reducing suffering. I mean, I'm a utilitarian. But the proposal to change people's pain and anxiety sensitivity does worry me for this reason. It seems like a real boon for the capitalists because they will be wiping their hands with glee because they can now, so, you know, people doing three jobs trying to get food on the table for their family and, you know, them and their kids suffering hunger sometimes. If the capitalists will think, oh, well, we can keep paying them even lower wages, we can allow them to work even longer hours and pay them less if we reduce their pain and their anxiety thresholds. So my thought is, shouldn't we really be first trying to fix up the basic global and national injustices around wealth distribution first and get the capitalists and basically get the capitalists in check?
Yes, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to part of this, at least many aspects of this perspective. I mean, I think we need everything from universal basic income, universal access to healthcare, guaranteed accommodation, a whole suite of political, social, economic reforms. And any serious approach to the problem of suffering needs to be twin track. It needs to combine the biological genetic that I focus on together with the political and the economic. And there's a danger, though, I think the only way long term to get rid of pain and suffering is to tackle its biological genetic roots. It can't be done in a vacuum. As you say, we need to tackle existing sources of injustice in the world. And yet the nature of the hedonic treadmill is such that even if we get absolutely everything right on the political, social, economic front, I mean, look at societies like, say, Scandinavia today, which, though not completely fair or just, nonetheless, one does have some version of the mixed economy that ensures everyone has a minimum basic decent standard of living and healthcare and stuff. Nonetheless, there are countless people, sadly, in Scandinavia, I can't say countless, one can actually quantify the numbers, who suffer depression, anxiety disorders, who have temperamentally a low hedonic set point. And unless we are actually prepared to recalibrate the hedonic treadmill, then all sorts of pain and suffering will continue indefinitely. And in terms of creating active citizens who participate rather than just get beaten down drudges, other things being equal, the higher your hedonic set point, the more likely you are to be an active citizen participating in civic society and lobbying. That, yeah, there is this brave new world scenario that's, you know, the equivalent of Soma will turn us into dupes of the ruling elites just toiling for their benefit. But actually, it tends to be the reverse. It tends to be depressive people who exhibit subordinate behavior, whereas people who are temperamentally happy, they're less likely to allow themselves to be bossed around. So really, I know it sounds a bit lame, but yeah, a twin track strategy. I write more about the biological genetic because a lot of the social political stuff has been written about better by others, and many of my thoughts are derivative. But if, and it's a big if, and this is another reason for going for a strategy of hedonic recalibration in the form of information sensitive gradients of well-being doesn't involve essentially overriding people's preferences and values. One of the big problems in the world in politics, everything from politics to personal relationships, is billions of people, they have logically irreconcilable preferences and desires. And one can give the trivial example of something like football. Every team wants every person wants their team to win. Most people are going to be disappointed. There is simply no way to reconcile people's conflicting preferences. But what one can do is lift them hedonically, conserving, in a sense, their existing values and preference architecture, but improving their default quality of life. And this is relevant to effective altruists who are saying we shouldn't be taking any rash, irrevocable decisions, having a period of long reflection by simply recalibrating hedonic set points and elevating pain thresholds. One is keeping all our options open for the future, whereas at the same time getting rid of the worst sources of suffering and then more moderate forms of suffering. And eventually, as I said, I believe an architecture of mind based entirely on information sensitive gradients of well-being. But I'm juggling timescales from the next few years and few decades to the next few centuries. And if one is talking about a future of life based on gradients of superhuman bliss, I suspect this is likely to be next millennium. If one is trying to win over an audience, it's always, well, almost always more compelling if you're talking about stuff that's going to happen in your lifetime. And some of the wilder transhumanist stuff, unless you believe in some kind of intelligence explosion, is not going to happen in the lifetime of most people in this discussion. Further thoughts, responses, if anyone would like to.
Unless Les wanted to ask a follow-up question, we have another one from Ariel Zelenzikow Johnson.
Don't worry about it, Adam.
I just wanted to say thanks, David, for a very informative response.
Oh, sorry, I'm aware part of it is incredibly simplistic, I know.
Feel free to ask follow-up questions, by the way. I think it's fine. We're adopting a sort of, I guess, more of a chat as well as a David Pearce talk. So
honestly, I think, anyone who's interested, obviously there's a bunch of stuff online, but I think it would probably be more fruitful essentially if it's, this kind of this kind of discussion. Yeah.
Adam, I think you wanted to ask a question first before I ask mine.
Adam Karlovsky, did you want to ask a question? Or me?
Yeah, never mind. I'll ask my question. So apologies, David, I missed the first 30 minutes of your talk, so I may be asking redundant information that's already been covered. But I've really appreciated your previous writing. In particular, I've seen your writing on the development of anesthesia and like how there was initial opposition to anesthesia and how people switched their mindsets towards like not having opposition to that. And I hope for the same sorts of things you were just talking about then in the 5 minutes I have heard to happen in the future. I guess my question is, I'm aware of like variation in individuals in terms of sodium channel pathologies or other ion channel issues, which mean people end up being, they have, like pain asymbolia, or like the inability to experience pain in different forms. And I think you were just talking about something else. But I guess I'm unclear on what are the specific treatments or mechanisms you envision that could change people's sort of like pain, or I guess like as distinct entities, pain or depressive or anxiety thresholds or like set points. And I was also unclear on whether the interventions you were talking about are things that would work for adult humans or only for like in embryo editing. So apologies if that's exactly what we've covered before, and if not, you can just point me in the right direction and I'll go read it myself.
We did touch on the role of the SCN9A gene, this so-called volume knob for pain. And it's going to be possible both to choose benign versions for future children, if respective parents can agree it's the socially responsible thing to do, and use gene therapy for existing humans. You mentioned pain asymbolia. It's possible for so-called normal people to experience something similar. If they, let's say, are in extreme pain and they are given morphine, although strong opioids are called painkillers, in some ways this is misleading. Someone given morphine for pain will say that they can still feel the pain, but it doesn't matter anymore. I mean, which essentially the nature of the experience changes. There are intimate links between physical and mental pain. And that, but by radically diminishing the intensity of pain, what actually is changing the nature of experience. And it's clearly vital if we are to turn pain essentially into just a useful signaling mechanism. I would forget for now the really ambitious stuff that I talk about of life based entirely on information sensitive gradients of bliss. But if we want to ensure everyone has the extremely high pain thresholds of, let's say, today's 0.1% genetic outliers, it's vital to maintain nociception, this sort of functionality. Now, one might imagine naively that the very happiest people who have very, temperamentally hypothymic, high pain thresholds, that they will be the most reckless. And in some contexts, this is true. But it's very striking that the people who love life the most, and this is true in whether in transhumanism, effective altruism, or elsewhere, it's the life lovers that tend to be most vigilant to possible threats, that tend to be most focused on the issue of existential risk. So simply having an extremely high pain threshold, extremely high hedonic set point doesn't per se make you reckless. It's much, much more complicated than that. And I think a world in which all forms of extreme suffering and eventually any form of suffering essentially, a world without pain based on information sensitive gradients of well-being will be much, much safer, even by the criteria of EA's transhumanists focused on the issues of existential risk. And what I mean by this is, right now, something like 850,000 people take their own lives each year. Many of them would take the rest of the world down with them if they could. Now imagine their counterparts next century with 22nd century technology. Many severely depressive, suicide people would take the world down with them if they could. But it's not just antinatalists, Benetarians, some forms of strong negative utilitarians and such who would like to obliterate existence. There are some non-depressive people who have a conditionally activated predisposition to want to destroy the world. I'll have to explain this. Take someone like a defeated dictator Hitler, with his Nero decree of March 1945, essentially ordering the destruction of Germany, the entire German infrastructure. Essentially, he was willing to take the entire German nation down with him rather than fail. And essentially, happiness and biohappiness is, this is obviously very crude and simplistic, is life affirming, whereas suffering is nihilistic. And the world will be a much, much safer place if we actually do adopt the strategy of trying to get rid of essentially all forms of nasty Darwinian traits that we have at the moment. Just one more point before I'll let other people make comments. The issue of anesthesia is useful. It would be completely outside the Overton window, though the term hadn't been invented. A couple of 100 years ago, the idea that you could have pain-free surgery, it was dismissed as utopian. It was built into the very nature of the surgeon's art that surgery was extraordinarily painful and nasty. And then, general anesthesia. For about 15 years, it was controversial. After all, it was sort of unbiblical, that woman is destined to suffer in childbirth. It was widely debated, but within the period of 15 years, it won global acceptance. And the idea of something like the abolitionist project getting rid of pain at the moment, it's way outside the the Overton window, and yet this could shift. I mean, we started off at the very start of this, the beginning of this talk, with the World Health Organization definition of health, and the World Health Organization is as establishment and widely respected as you can get. But how else can we actually deliver the World Health Organization definition of health? Complete physical, social, and emotional well-being. Is this outside the Overton window? No, it's enshrined in the WHO constitution that all its members have signed up to. And the WHO recently reaffirmed its constitution too. I think, essentially we need powerful, dynamic, probably young, but certainly powerful and dynamic personalities to essentially lobby the WHO, make sure it lives up to its responsibilities to good health for all. And rather than talking in the language of transhumanism and superhuman bliss, it's probably going to be more effective to talk in the language of health. And the WHO, in its definition of health, it's not saying anything about whether one should be a classical negative utilitarian. It's not taking any particular stance on ethics or meta-ethics. Essentially, it's talking entirely in the language of health. Thank you, Adam, for getting the correct quote. WHO definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. Further on, the rights to health, the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic or social condition. This is almost unimaginably ambitious. I've been talking about the possibility of creating life based on information-sensitive gradients of well-being, but the WHO is talking about complete well-being. Now, to me, this is beyond transhumanism. This is completely post-human, because I think it is vital to retain information sensitivity and so to enable everyone to retain critical insight, social responsibility, intellectual progress. But essentially, we already have the manifesto of a transhumanist organization. Now, possibly some people at the WHO would say, oh, well, we didn't really mean that, but it's there. I mean, the only way to get anything remotely approximating to the WHO definition of health is to combine the socio-economic with the biological genetic.
I mean, it spells out what they mean by health right there. They describe what health is, but they don't describe what well-being is.
Yes, I don't think they explicitly define well-being. If one is talking to a more, shall we say, conservative audience, it's probably best to use the language of well-being rather than bliss, happiness. But yeah, I don't know what people think is the best way forward, whether in effective altruism or transhumanism or the wider world. As I said, I'm a writer. I'm not an organizer. I do my best, but actually, in terms of taking the whole project forward, I don't know if people have strong feelings about what we should be doing.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, if we could have an existence proof where people who are currently melancholy could have a sustainable way to uplift in a measurable way, their hedonic set points in a way that doesn't have any negative side effects. And I mean, we do have this sort of the golden sledgehammers of drugs, but they often come with come downs and nasty side effects. So I'd kind of rule them out, but I still think that they may give sort of like a window into what life could possibly be like if somebody's tried a drug and they've experienced super happiness for a short period of time. Thinking, well, it doesn't necessarily have to come with a come down or some negative side effect down the road. Yeah. So if there could be a drug in the near term that could sort of convince people that, hey, maybe we should really be pouring a whole heap of our GDP into developing better ones, then yeah, existence proofs.
Yes. There are a number of interesting drugs on the horizon, but not yet Soma. One of the big discoveries of 2020 last year was the role of the ACKR3 receptor in regulating endogenous levels of opioids, native opioid function. And at least in animal models, this works essentially that by blocking the ACKR3 receptor in the brain, this elevates native endogenous opioid levels and improves hedonic tone. Drugs that block the ACKR3 receptor don't have straightforwardly abuse potential in the way of existing opioids. So essentially, you're sabotaging the negative feedback mechanisms in the brain that depress most people's hedonic tone. I said this is new work, but in principle, at any rate, it ought to be possible to raise everyone's default hedonic tone by blocking the ACKR3 receptor. But this is very early days, all kinds of pitfalls, all kinds of possible side effects, because the ACKR3 receptor is bound up with immune function too. But yeah, rather than entirely focusing on long-term biological genetic strategy, one can be also focusing on trying to develop superior versions of Soma. But yeah, as we know, drugs have countless pitfalls. Even if one can deal with the problem of tolerance, does one want a society in which people are essentially drug-oriented? in a very benign sense, this is true today in the sense of coffee. A lot of us, I'm one of them anyway, my daily existence revolves around cups of tea and coffee, and it's self-limiting. There's no temptation to uncontrolled dose escalation. But imagine if one could have something akin to coffee, but with a much more powerful mood elevating effect. And yet part of me is still thinking, wouldn't it be much better for the long term if we could get our hedonic defaults much higher than today? That constantly trying to fine tune our state of mind by drugs, it's less than desirable. And as we know from countless tragedies with drugs, countless potential tragedies in the making.
So Rusty, are you there? Do you want to ask a question?
I am. I did have one, thank you, but I'll not have a fight with you about order. So, it's in the transhumanist community has a high frequency of scientists. So, surely your problem is the Westminster equivalent of the Overton window. Okay, the politicians are now pretending that they respect scientists since COVID. Yeah, I'm sorry I said COVID. I think I was the first to say it. Sorry, but the patronage has increased a little bit since the miracle of the global scientific community zapping out a vaccine. So, given the scientific literacy of and frequency of scientists within your communities, can't you leverage that kind of muscle? Like your man from Ghostbusters, back off, we're scientists.
Yes, it was. It's quite astonishing, given, I was going to say global consensus, though that's an exaggeration, but the extremely widespread acceptance worldwide that we ought to be tackling COVID with vaccination. Imagine an equivalent degree of urgency with tackling sources of mental and physical pain. But sadly, it is complete fantasy politically for now, at least until some powerful mainstream figures campaign. And in the little PDF I've sent you, sorry, there's no fancy video here, but this is just to show what is going to be technically feasible. This is a case of intravenous gene therapy has been used to treat transthyretin amyloidosis, and three ingredients here. I'm just going to read one of the slides. CRISPR-Cas9 is a scissors-like tool that can cut and edit DNA. Treatment involves 1, lipid nanoparticles that carry a payload of CRISPR machinery, 2, a strand of guide ribonucleic acid, and 3, a sequence of messenger ribonucleic acid. And there are 3 ingredients in this new, extremely exciting treatment of this severe progressive disorder, transthyretin amyloidosis. In this one-off injection, billions of the CRISPR-carrying nanoparticles are infused into the bloodstream. The nanoparticles make their way to the liver, the source of the dysfunctional protein. 2, the messenger RNA instructs the cells to produce the Cas9 protein, CRISPR's genetic scissors. The Cas9 protein then links up with the guide RNA, seeks out the target gene and snips it. 3, the cell repairs this DNA at the site of the break, but imperfectly. Imperfect repair switches off the gene and shuts down production of the misfolded protein. And in the PDF, there is a link for people who want to dig deeper. Now, we don't yet know if there are going to be unexpected side effects, but this form of CRISPR infusion offers the possibility of gene therapy for people with existing genetic disorders. And it'd be also possible to use the therapy to boost everything from hedonic set points to pain thresholds. But how do you persuade people that this is a form of therapeutic intervention we should be trying? And this is, as I said, one of my reasons for thinking that a biohappiness revolution will take hundreds of years rather than a century, is that it is a huge challenge, that status quo bias is immense. It's not simply status quo bias in that the therapy I'm describing just now actually costs several $1 million. But just as decoding the first human genome cost $1 billion or so, now it's down to $100 or less. Costs would very rapidly fall. But I don't think cost is going to be the decisive objection. Are we going to be able to shift the Overton window towards gene therapies? Would you want to upgrade your own genome, not as some kind of DIY hacker process, but in consultation with your doctor and specialists? What are in terms of pitfalls, we've barely even begun to discuss them.
But most people don't know the processes of the medicine they're receiving, so you wouldn't necessarily get resistance as a default reaction from say the likes of me. Thank you, doctor. That feels great.
Hundreds of millions of people suffer from chronic pain. And those of us who don't suffer chronic pain, it can come as a real shock just how nasty acute pain can be when one experiences it. And I suspect if these therapeutic interventions were on offer and various role models were prominently to use them, then there would be a shift. But whereas the transition to pain-free surgery, essentially the controversy had ended in 15 years, this is going to take hundreds of years. And skeptics of anesthesia, they weren't completely wrong-headed, because anesthesia does carry risks, both of the more obvious and gross kinds and the more subtle kinds too. And though some of the obvious risks can be in terms of mood elevation, elevating pain thresholds, can be discussed now. I mean, the long-term ramifications of a whole hypothalamic society essentially are unknown. But back to what I was just saying before, though, on the whole, if we can turn people into fanatical life lovers, and though the world does have fanatical life lovers, it has an awful lot of people who think of life as a vale of tears, and a non-negligible percentage who would really be actually glad to be shot of it and would bring the world down with them. I think potentially it is essentially the different strands of transhumanism and effective altruism ought to be able to work together on existing sources of suffering. I don't think it, as I said, my inclination really is that the world will be safer without the horrors of suffering. But I suppose it would help if there was someone here who is currently defending the long-termist, even the strong long-termist position. I mean, it's associated with Will McGaskill, Toby Ord. Will McGaskill is writing a book at the moment, Obligation to Future Generations, strong long-termism. Toby Ord calling for a period of long reflection. I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like Toby, for example, he has an extremely high hedonic set point. The problem of suffering doesn't loom large in his life. I recall, it must be about a decade, over a decade now. Essentially, we were discussing essentially veganism, vegetarianism, closing factory farms, and he was saying that but non-human animals in factory farms, they wouldn't exist without us. And for him, it was just so self-evident it was better to be alive than not to be alive. And Toby describes negative utilitarianism, which is my own ethic. Now, that we have an overriding obligation to minimize, mitigate, prevent all forms of suffering is a devastatingly callous ethic. So, how are the different strands of transhumanism, effective altruism going to work more effectively together?
Thank you.
I'm easy. Ariel can go first.
Okay, so I'll jump in. So for context, I'm a neuroscientist, and I remember going to the Society for Neuroscience conference a few years ago, where one of the plenary speakers described the absolute failure of neuroscience research to try and develop novel treatments for anxiety and depression in the last 20 years. So we've had selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors developed, I don't know the exact history, but let's say sometime in the 90s. And since then, we've barely had anything that really helps much at all in improvement to that sort of thing. And part of when I don't work in this space directly, so I'm not an expert in it. But when I think about it, it seems to me that it might not be as simple as just trying to discover the next small molecule that we can give to people reliably. It might require more radical interventions, some sort of therapy that affects the amygdala in some way, or neural circuitry that would require either more invasive application or some sort of gene therapy in combination with a more invasive application, or any of those sorts of things. And these things seem to be really outside the Overton window of treatments that people are exploring, particularly because I agree with you that they seem to minimize how terrible it is to actually be suffering, and also because people aren't super creative and they use things which they know work to a certain degree. I guess they try deep brain stimulation for depression as an example, but not more radical therapies. So this is a bit of a long-winded intro, but I guess what I'm getting to is do you speak to neuroscientists or are aware of neuroscientists who care about the sorts of things that you're describing here? Or do you feel as though the neuroscience community has largely been neglecting what you're talking about or your interests are here?
Wouldn't say neglecting. You're right about, sadly, the history of treatments of depression over the past 40, 50 years. That, we've passed from monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the tricyclics, the SSRIs. Essentially, they help a large minority of people. Very few people, SSRIs might feel better than well, but they don't work or only work imperfectly for many people. And what is the underlying reason for this? I would say it's because the neurotransmitter system most involved in hedonic tone is the opioid system, or more specifically, the mu opioid receptor. That, excuse me, I'm going to have to take a pastel because my throat is dry, so please excuse me while I do this. And that's, although opioids are called painkillers, they are probably in some ways really antidepressants, but antidepressants with unacceptable side effects. And for obvious reasons, responsible educators, doctors are not keen to stress this. But if you do take a powerful or even not so potent mu opioid, even if you are severely depressed, you are likely to feel well. I mean, so I recall a quote from Andrew Weil in From Chocolate to Morphine. Someone who had experienced lifelong depression. She was saying she took codeine, and for the first time in her life, she actually felt well or normal. Now, clearly, one needs to tread incredibly carefully here, because opioids have countless problems. I needn't rehearse them all. Tolerance, dependence, they can make people asocial rather than antisocial. The solution to the problem of depression is not giving people opioids, but the reason I think that essentially antidepressant therapy has stalled is that essentially, just as imagine if one were to try to treat juvenile diabetes without using insulin. We're ignoring the actual the critical neurosystem involved. And so, I think what is going to be needed is this combination of drugs that re-regulate the opioid system. LIH 383 has been developed by the Luxembourg Institute of Mental Health that blocks the ACKR3 receptor, and in principle can therefore elevate endogenous opioids. That combines ways to elevate the hedonic tone of existing people, together with a strategy of encouraging prospective parents to take responsibility for their children's health and choose benign genes and allelic combinations. But incredibly controversial. One sees from the recall the first CRISPR babies in China a few years ago. Very controversial. Officially, the reason for the rogue scientist in question, he was doing it so that the kids would be born with protection against HIV. But the particular genetic alteration in question in animal models boosts cognitive capacity. And so almost certainly the scientist in question was trying to create smart babies with HIV as a cover. We don't know if the parents were aware of this, and I suspect, being Chinese, they would have probably been quite keen on the idea of having smarter babies. I suspect a lot of the opposition to CRISPR babies in the scientific community was envy, sadly, because at the moment, all new children are genetic experiments. And this scientist was conducting a genetic experiment. But yes, as I said, it's not very inspiring if a speaker says that the obstacles daunt them. But somehow I think, we need to have a debate about bringing new life and suffering into the world. That at the moment, any prospective parents ought to be aware of the fact that by creating life, they are going to be creating immense amounts of suffering. The natural selection didn't design us to be happy. If they aren't prepared to load the genetic dice in favor of their offspring, there is a very high likelihood that at some time in their kid's life, that their kid will suffer from depression, severe anxiety disorders, heartache, all manner of ills. And I mean, personally, I'm an anti-natalist. I said I wouldn't myself want to bring new life and suffering in the world, but the future doesn't belong to anti-natalists. The future belongs to natalists and the life lovers, and the only way to actually solve the problem of suffering in the long term is to have this global transition to responsible parenthood. And how we bring this about, yes, daunting. I mean, just one thing that I think some transhumanists, at least, they believe AI is going to solve all our problems. I'm a skeptic there, but a lot of transhumanists have a background in AI, and if one does believe, for example, we're on the brink of an intelligence explosion, then, well, can't post-human superintelligence sort out all our problems?
Les Allen, did you have another question there?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. David, I wonder whether you've got a specific response to the virtue ethicist objector who says all this focus on minimizing pain and suffering and maximizing pleasure or happiness, sure, that's important, but you've missed an important ingredient in what makes our lives worthwhile. And of course, that's, developing and exercising the virtues. And one of the virtues is, steadfastness, courage in the face of ordeals, pain and suffering. Do away with pain and suffering to a big extent. You've done away with what's valuable in life, developing and exercising the virtues.
Yes, I'm in favor of exercising the virtues, but we can use biotechnology to amplify our virtues. And one immense problem that a lot of people suffer from is what the Greeks used to call akrasia, or weakness of will. And that by boosting dopamine function, it would be possible to be hyper-motivated all the ways that one thinks one ought to behave and doesn't. With a more powerful dopamine system, one's willpower can be greater. And back to this point about by stressing recalibration rather than bliss maximization, if let's say you're a virtue ethicist and you think exhibiting virtues trumps all else, then simply having your hedonic set point recalibrated so you're much more cheerful, you'll still retain your existing values and preference architecture, but your default quality of life will be so much higher. And if you opt to amplify your dopamine function, you can also be far more intensely motivated. Another problem with the virtue ethicist approach is that most of the suffering in the world isn't actually undergone by humans, but by non-human animals, whether in factory farms or in the wild. And yeah, when it comes to no humans, one can't really think, in terms of enhancing their virtues as distinct, perhaps one day, optionally, cognitive uplift. Now, Adam has, sorry, feel free to follow that up. I'm just reading. Adam has.
Yeah, I've just got one bit of follow-up there, David. Wouldn't the virtue ethicist say modifying your genetic makeup to give you a higher drive to exercise the virtues? That's not really then developing your virtues under your own steam. You're using a fix. Well, that's not what developing virtues is about. It's using your own steam. That's cheating.
Well, it might be cheating, but we are cheating in so many ways, from wearing clothes to using technology like video conferencing and the like. Essentially, natural selection, evolution via natural selection, didn't design us to be virtuous. For a start, it designed us to be egocentric. I seem to be the center of the universe, the hub of reality that follows me around, and this is not conducive to impartial virtue. And of course, it's an extremely adaptive illusion, the egocentric illusion that makes almost everyone feel that they are the center of the world. And there are just countless other nasty genetic predispositions that humans have, from jealousy, envy, resentment, even things like spite have an evolutionary rationale. And does one conceive virtue as trying to overcome these innately vicious predispositions? Sadly, any of our would-be ancestors who were able to overcome their baser instincts, they weren't the ones who left more copies of their genes. And so as I see it, we want to make human nature, animal nature, innately, intrinsically virtuous, crudely. Adam, sorry, feel free to follow this up. Otherwise I'm just going to read Adam. A project that has potential to overcome conservative bioethics might be to explicitly address retention of information-sensitive well-being and its potential externalities. Perhaps hire decision theorists to map out and simulate the interactions for a model group of hypothymics. Then map out causes for negative outcomes and trade-offs. Economists, sociologists, population level, neuroscientists, psychologists at the intrapersonal level. In a way, this would be the hedonic equivalent of MIRI. If this doesn't seem like a low-hanging fruit, what would be a higher priority? What would be higher priority? The loving nerd's revenge, says Rusty. Yes, that's.
So apologies for bringing a bit of tabloid humour there, sorry, mate, but it was meant not pejoratively. It was meant, yeah, go for
it. No, please. Any burning questions that people? I say that we can do a follow up. I don't know how much longer my voice is not doing brilliantly at the moment. But any particular points, criticisms that people would like to see tackled that I have just ignored or haven't been tackled inadequately? And thank you, Adam. Yeah, proper responses. Yeah, gonna need need an optional. If that's okay, I'm for now, with Adam's permission, going to be thinking of winding up for now. Once again, apologies if people feel issues have been glossed over. Adam, can I pass over to you if there are any last minute thoughts or reflections or possible follow-ups? I don't know if Adam can hear us.
Okay, I guess you mean me. There are two Adams in the chat rooms, but
forgive me.
Yes, it's been wonderful listening to you answer such well-formed questions during this discussion. I'm looking forward to your new book that is coming out. It's not something we've touched on yet. I guess in winding up, would you like to give us a description of the book? What it's based on, what previous work it's based on, and when we can expect to see it fly out of the shelves and appear in airline bookshops, airport bookshops.
Yeah. I wish I could send you an advanced copy or even a publication date. Yes, soon, relatively soon, though I haven't got a date. I hope to be releasing the Biohappiness Revolution, which is essentially an update on the hedonistic imperative, written, I hope, in a more accessible style with less jargon. The hedonistic imperative was written in 1995 for an audience of analytic philosophers. Back in 1995, the human genome hadn't been decoded. Cultured meat was sci-fi. Gene drives, the very notion of a gene drive that cheats the laws of Mendelian inheritance, which sounded ecologically illiterate. Essentially, the Biohappiness Revolution is an update of the hedonistic imperative, but hopefully for a wider audience. I rather cheated on Facebook by uploading a cover or some covers that the designer had done. There is still work that needs to be done on the book, for example, I didn't in the first draft include any discussion of long-termism in effective altruism, which I confess has very much disconcerted me. But yeah, essentially the Biohappiness Revolution, setting out the abolitionist project and what lies beyond. Unlike a Ray Kurzweil, yeah, I'm afraid I'm not making any promises. There's no 2045, not even a 2085. I think it is a long-term project for humanity. But yeah, mastery of our genetic source code does give intelligent moral agents the ability to get rid of the biology of pain and suffering and replace existing horrors and squalor and just everyday malaise of life with a world, an entire civilization based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And that is what I think we ought to be aiming for as a civilization. So yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Adam, and thank you for the participants here. Are you going to account for a foreword from a beloved mascot like David Attenborough? Quite what David Attenborough would think of the idea of reprogramming predators, I don't know. I suspect he would be appalled. Reprogramming predators. Yeah, how is one going to deal with the problem of predation? Personally, I wouldn't be sad if existing predatory life forms were simply non-violently retired. Most people, on the other hand, are very keen on retaining so-called charismatic megafauna like lions, but it's going to be possible to essentially reprogram lions so that they no longer asphyxiate zebras, starting off with stopgaps like catnip flavored mincemeat, artificial mincemeat, but then going on to reprogramming. And though you might think, well, this is completely outside the Overton window, if one is introducing people to the idea of a world without predation, one starts with the Bible, the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah. And so rather than telling people that this is some crazy new idea that some transhumanist dreamed up in the bathtub, one stresses that this is very ancient antecedents, that the Garden of Eden was vegan, that the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah was vegan. The Bible leaves out the technical details, sounds a bit ecologically illiterate, whereas what we can now do with a combination of biotech and and IT is actually engineer the peaceable kingdom of Isaiah. Will it satisfy critics? Perhaps not, but I think the long-term future of the biosphere is vegan, or vegan and in vitrotarian, that sentient beings shouldn't harm each other, and biotech gives us the tools for the job.
Wonderful, David. It's been such an inspiration to hear you talk again. I'm looking forward to at some stage doing it again, maybe next year.
The book tour post-COVID, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, post-COVID, maybe 2024 or 25 at this rate, but let's hope.
Well, we've had the privilege of having David in Australia a couple of times, one for a conference I organised, another one for a conference I helped organise. And got plenty of interviews done then. It was really fun. But yes, very much looking to catching up with you again in person.
And yeah, I very much look forward to seeing those of you in Australia when I swing by next. And yeah, very special thank you for Adam for all his work over the years, for essentially capturing the full gamut of transhumanist thought with his videos. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. Sorry about any technical hiccups, and I promise I will do my fallible best to answer any follow-ups too.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody, and there'll be more of these at some stage in the future. So, yes, stay tuned.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. I'm going to log off now and make myself a coffee. Take care and infinite bliss. Bye-bye.
Infinite bliss. Cheers, Dave.